week. So we're going to finish regarding trade theory. Then we'll move on to factor proportions trade theory. So as I hope most of you will remember, what we're doing here is we have a general equilibrium model of home and the foreign economies. And on the horizontal axis, it's a continuum of goods. So we went from a silly two-good case to many, many good scenario. And on the vertical axis, we have the relative wage, and as well as relative productivity. So the curve RD is downward sloping because what we've done explicitly is to order the relative productivity of the home country in descending order from left to right. So good zero, if you want, is the good where the productivity of home relative to foreign is the highest. And as you can see, although we don't have the number 1 anywhere on this diagram, we will have in others, it's very likely that productivity is greater than 1. So it may well be that home's productivity, for whatever reason, we will go into more detail in this second topic. For whatever reason, home has a productivity that is 3 times foreign in that particular good zero. And then, of course, by construction, as we moved to the right, that relative productivity of home in all the various goods keeps on falling. And so what we now need is to know where is the cutoff. So the cutoff on this diagram is at that point M. So all the goods from 0 to M, that range of goods from 0 to M, is going to be produced by home. Why? Because the relative wage, which is given by the intersection of the two curves, is such that any goods produced from 0 to M will have relative productivity that is more than compensated by the relative wage. In other words, it may well be, we don't know, but it may well be that home has, on average, a wage that is higher than foreign, but it will still manage to produce and export all the goods from 0 to M because its relative productivity is going to be higher than its relative wage. So if home has a wage that is twice as high as foreign, but from all the goods from 0 to M, its relative productivity is more than twice that of foreign, home can be competitive in those goods. In other words, it can produce them at a lower cost. Yeah? And from M to 1, it's obviously the reverse, so foreign will be producing and exporting those goods to home. And consumers in both regions or countries will be buying the whole range. Yeah? So this diagram is complete once you have that RS, that relative supply curve. And that relative supply curve, as I told you, captures the idea that in an open economy, more or less, the value of what you export has to be equal to the value of what you import. Of course, there are trade deficits and so on, but as I told you, on average, they're small. 5%, 2%, 7% is already very big. So trade theory evolved by not worrying about the possibility of spending more than you produce. That is, trade theory evolves without considering the possibility that you may borrow or lend from abroad. Yeah? So every time the UK runs a current-account deficit, it's effectively drawing on assets or borrowing from abroad. So what we're saying here is that once you impose the condition, which is a fairly good approximation that you cannot run a trade deficit, so your trade balance account has to be on balance, then the value of your imports has to be equal to the value of your exports, right? And so that curve being upward sloping is simply reflecting the fact that if the relative wage, the variable that is measured on the vertical axis, if the relative wage in home is higher, so as we move from 0 upwards, it means that home will have to be selling and therefore exporting more stuff. And that's why the relationship is upward sloping. If you start with a point such as this, and then you say, what sort of range of exports would be compatible with home having a higher relative wage, so in this region? And the answer is home would have to be able to sell more stuff, and so it would need to be able to export more goods. That's why the range has now increased to the from this value to that value there. Yeah. So and this. This general equilibrium model is the sort of analysis that you can use to make sense, for example, of why is it that in many cases countries with large populations that are growing will tend to, yes, export more compared to the small country, but also very often have lower relative wages. And it can also be used, of course, by seeing what happens when there is technological progress, and in particular, what happens when the productivity increases in all the sectors at the same time. And what could be behind that would be either a sort of general purpose technology like computers or the internet that effectively affect productivity in all sectors, or just accumulation of a factor such as capital. What happens in an economy when productivity increases? And as always, what we do is to, and this applies to pretty much all of your economics, we only look at the shock at the time. So we're saying, let's isolate these forces. In the real world, lots of things are happening at the same time, and let's try to analyze what would happen if only one of these would change. So this is the case for this figure 9. What we ask is, what would happen if home's labour force increased relative to foreign? And what you see is that there is no reason why the RD curve that reflects those differences in productivity should change. However, the RS curve should change, and it would shift to the right. And the basic reason why it shifts to the right is because the country that now has a higher population, in order to sustain the same standard of living per worker, so in order to sustain the same relative wage, the variable that is measured on the vertical axis, it will have to be producing and exporting a greater range of goods. Yeah? And so that's what is reflected by this shift like this. Of course, the curve still goes through zero, through the origin, although it's a kind of nonsensical scenario, because if you have a zero income, a zero wage, then that's compatible with not producing anything. Yeah? So the shift is not parallel, it's a shift like this. But what we see, and that's the interesting thing, as you can see, is that there was a shock in one country, and it had repercussions on the patterns of trade. And like so many things, this shows the huge interconnection in the world. As you can see, the range of products that is produced by home and is now exported has changed. It used to be 0M, it's now 0M dash. Now foreign hasn't done anything, but the reality is that home needs to be producing and exporting more stuff to take into account that increase in the population. And the way home is going to be able to be producing this extra range of goods M to M dash is by becoming relatively more productive than foreign. And that is achieved because of a decrease in the relative wage. In other words, until the shock, foreign would be producing all the goods from M to 1 because it would be able to do it at a lower cost. After this increase in population at home, relative wages at home will decrease sufficiently from this value to that value so that home is now able to produce more goods at a lower cost. And so as you can see, this shows interdependence. It really shows that in many cases, how much you produce is going to depend crucially on your relative wages. If I'm able to have wages that are low enough, I will be able to produce a much bigger range of products than otherwise. Yeah? Okay, well, figure 10 kind of links with your essay title. It is also interesting because it's showing you, again, how we are so interrelated. So here we're saying that there was the labels to figure 10 is the impact of an increase in homes' general productivity. So as you can see, that the RD curve shifted upwards to RD dash, and it's sort of in a parallel way. So what we're really saying is that there was an increase in the productivity in all sectors of, for example, 20%. And it makes sense because of the way the curve was determined to see this as a parallel shift. Of course, it doesn't have to be like this. Sometimes productivity will increase more in some sectors than in others. So that curve may shift in different ways. So it may well be that, for example, if the increase in productivity is in the goods that are close to the zero, then there would be an increase, a shift upward like this, and then it might well be that it goes down and remains more or less the same. And all of these things can be studied using these diagrams, and you should be able to explain the economic intuition behind the various results. But in this case, it's a general increase in productivity. As you can see, even though nothing has happened to foreign, because trade is about relative, comparative advantage, in this case, foreign is also affected. It's going to be producing and exporting a smaller number of goods after the increase in productivity. So what's the logic? Well, at home, productivity has increased. So it means that every single worker is now producing more than before. But of course, output, which is produced by the worker, or their productivity, is going to be equal to income. And it's also equal to expenditure. So these guys will want to sell more and to buy more. But as you can see, they're selling to both home consumers and to foreign consumers. And nothing has happened to the foreign consumers, that is, they haven't benefited from any increase in productivity, right? So how can you convince the foreign consumers to buy more stuff from you? And the answer, as you can see, you can only convince the foreign consumers to buy more stuff if you're now selling products at a lower cost than before. And how can you sell the products at a lower price than before? The answer, because your increase in productivity, in relative productivity, was less than matched by an increase in your relative wage. So as you can see, clearly home benefits from the increase in productivity. Their relative wage has gone up from this to that. Yeah, relative wage is measured on the vertical axis. So of course, as predicted by basic neoclassical growth theory, basic macro, home is benefiting. Everyone gets a higher wage. But what we see here is that the increase in your wage is not the same as the increase in productivity. Productivity has shifted upward by this distance. Your relative wage has shifted up, but by less. But it's precisely because of this, it's precisely because even though productivity may have increased by 50%, your wage has only increased by 40%, that you now are able to produce a greater range of products from M to N dash at a lower cost than your rival, than foreign. And that's why you'll now be exporting those goods. Yeah? Okay, now more stuff that you can do with this. So the focus on this small country, and this is relevant, of course, because so many people have this belief that unless you're a giant such as the US or China or